When my wife passed away, my sons called to say they couldn't make it. The older one coldly said he was busy with a multi-million-dollar merger. The younger one just texted my flight's delayed dad. You'll have to handle it. The next day, a stranger handed me a photo. My two sons frantically digging beside my wife's grave at 3 a.m. I froze, my hands trembling as I stared at the picture, unable to believe what I was seeing. Then he leaned closer, his voice low and cold. I have something even worse, he whispered. Do you want to see it? Welcome to the story. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. A quick note, parts of this story include fictional elements created for storytelling and reflection, while the message is meant to resonate beyond the screen. The dirt didn't just fall, it screamed as it hit the lid of Vivian's mahogany casket, a hollow thud that echoed through the empty whiteout of the Oak Haven cemetery. I stood there, Arthur Street. Claire, a 68-year-old retired bridge inspector with shoulders stooped by 40 winters as the lone sentry at my wife's burial. The wind whipped across the open ridge, carrying the scent of damp earth and frozen pine biting into my cheeks with the ferocity of a predator. I was alone. There were no mourners, no black umbrellas, no soft words of comfort from the sons who had promised they would be by my side. I gripped the silver handle of my cane, my knuckles turning as white as the snow, piling up around my boots. I'm sorry, Vivian, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the howl of the storm. I'm the only one who showed up. I looked at the empty space where Julian and Dominic should have stood. Julian, my eldest, had called an hour before the service, sounding harried and frantic about an emergency merger that required his immediate presence in the city. Dominic the younger hadn't even bothered to call, sending a curt text about a flight delay that seemed far too convenient. 32 years, gone in a thud of frozen mud. I had spent my career checking the structural integrity of steel and concrete, ensuring that the bridges people crossed every day wouldn't crumble beneath them. I could spot a hairline fracture in a support beam from 50 paces, yet I had been blind to the rot eating away at the foundation of my own family. As the cemetery workers began to move in with their heavy machinery, their faces obscured by thermal masks, I turned away. I couldn't watch them finish the job. The trek back to the car was a battle. Every step through the knee-deep drifts felt like wading through wet cement. The cold was an invasive thing, a needle-sharp pressure that settled deep in my joints and made my breath come in ragged, crystalline gasps. I reached my old sedan, the metallic cold of the car door handle searing my palm through my gloves. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers clumsy and numb, until the engine finally turned over with a reluctant groan. I clicked on the radio, hoping for some weather news, but instead I caught the tail end of a local business report. The announcer's voice was crisp and clear, stating that the rumored merger between Julian's firm and the Sterling Group had been officially canceled 2 days ago due to a lack of funding. The emergency Julian had cited was a phantom, a lie crafted to avoid the shadow of a grave. Is this how a legacy dies? Not with a bang, but with a silent driveway and a cold engine. I drove through the abandoned streets of Oak Haven, passing the diner where Vivian and I had shared 40 years of Sunday breakfasts, and the park where I had taught the boys to ride their bikes. These landmarks, once the anchors of my life, now looked alien, stripped of their meaning by the white shroud of the blizzard. A growing sense of paranoia gripped me as I looked into the rearview mirror. Dark shapes seemed to flit between the tree line at the edge of the road, and the silence of the cabin felt heavy, as if someone were sitting in the back seat, watching the back of my neck. I forced myself to focus on the road, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. By the time I pulled into the long, winding driveway of the street, Claire Estate, the evening had settled in, blue and bruised. I expected the warm glow of the porch light to guide me in, but the house sat in total darkness. The porch light was dead, its glass housing shattered by the wind, or perhaps something more deliberate. I climbed the steps, each movement a Herculean effort. There, wedged into the gap of the heavy oak door, was an object that didn't belong. It was a gold-embossed card, its surface gleaming even in the dim twilight. I reached out my hand, shaking as I pulled it free. The card felt unnaturally heavy, the paper thick and expensive. I turned it over and read the elegant flowing script that shattered my remaining sanity. Your sons didn't miss the burial. They just arrived early for the inheritance. The words blurred before my eyes. What is this? I gasped, looking around the empty porch. Who was here? The implication was a physical blow to the chest. If they weren't at the service and they weren't in the city, then they had been here. They had been in my house, picking through the bones of my life while Vivian was being lowered into the ground. They hadn't missed the cemetery because of work or travel. They had performed a secret action, a calculated trespass that I had completely missed. The blizzard outside was nothing compared to the ice forming around my heart as I touched that card. I felt a sudden sharp realization that the people I had raised were strangers to me, predators wearing the faces of my children. I leaned against the door, the cold of the wood seeping through my coat, feeling my psychological foundation give way. I had built bridges to last a century, but I had failed to build a single path to the hearts of my own sons. As I stared at the elegant gold card, my phone began to vibrate in my frozen pocket, with a call from a number that hadn't existed for 40 years. I fumbled with the phone, my numb fingers nearly dropping it into the snowbank as the screen illuminated the dark porch with a spectral blue glow. The vibration was a frantic mechanical buzzing against my thigh that seemed to mock the stillness of the cemetery I had just left. My breath came in shallow white plumes as I stared at the display. The number was a sequence I hadn't seen on a digital screen, a string of digits that belonged to a copper wire era, long since buried. I pressed the answer button, and for a moment, there was only the rhythmic scratching sound of the caller's breathing, like a persistent rodent behind a baseboard. Arthur, a voice said. It was Elias Thorne, a man with a voice like yellowed parchment and gravel, who spoke through the line with the cold authority of a man who had been dead for decades. Elias had been my former business partner, the silent architect of our firm's early success, but he had vanished into the shadows of a legal scandal 40 years ago. Only Elias ever called me Artie Boy, a private nickname that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the freezing wind. Artie Boy, the storm isn't outside, he continued, his tone raspy and rhythmic, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. It's in the soil your sons moved this morning. My throat tightened, the cold air turning to lead in my lungs. Who is this? I demanded, though the recognition was already curdling in my gut. How do you know my name? The voice didn't waver. The digging began before the casket even touched the ground, Arthur. Your boys aren't mourning, they're measuring. If you want to see the blueprints of your own destruction, meet me where the history is kept. The line went dead before I could speak another word, leaving me with nothing but the hum of the wind and the mocking gold card in my hand. I pushed through the front door, the warmth of the hallway, feeling like a physical weight. The silence inside the house was heavier than the blizzard outside a suffocating vacuum, where Vivian's laughter used to live. I didn't stop to take off my heavy coat. I retreated straight to my study, the floorboards groaning under my feet like a warning. I switched on the magnifying lamp on my desk, the sudden circle of light harsh and clinical. This was where I had spent decades hunched over bridge schematics, looking for the stress fractures that others missed. I placed the gold embossed card under the lens. My habit from my days as an inspector took over. I looked for the inconsistencies, the hidden flaws in the craft. How many years do you have to live with a person before you realize you're sleeping next to a stranger? I wondered as I peered through the glass. My sons were my own flesh, yet I was dissecting a card they had left behind like it was a piece of forensic evidence. Then I saw it. Tucked into the corner of the heavy cardstock was a microscopic watermark, an emblem of a firm that had been wiped from the books in 1981 Crawford Ashford construction. This watermark, it's impossible, I whispered to the empty room. That firm died with Reginald. It was the company Elias and I had built, the one that had been dismantled and buried under a mountain of debt and accusations. The lamp flickered, and for a split second the shadows on the wall looked like reaching hands clawing for the edge of my desk. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter. This wasn't just a prank by my sons. This was a ghost reaching out from the foundation of my life. I flipped the card over. The reverse side appeared blank at first, but I knew better. I held the card close to the heat of the desk lamp's bulb, the warmth radiating against my cold skin. Slowly, like a bruise forming under the skin, lines of ink began to appear. They were coordinates, followed by a time Oak Haven Library, 10 a.m. Below the coordinates, a final line of text, manifested in a sharp, jagged hand. If you call the police now, you'll be the one they arrest for Vivian's accident. My heart gave a painful, irregular thud. Accident. There had been no accident. Vivian had slipped away in her sleep, her heart finally giving up after years of struggle. Or so I had been told. They think I killed her, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. They're setting me up. My own sons, the cardiologist and the businessman, were weaving a noose out of my own grief. I felt a wave of desperation, followed by a cold, strategic resolve. I was an inspector. I knew how to find the point of failure. I reached for the card again, noticing a slight thickness to the paper that hadn't been there before. I took a letter opener and carefully slit the edge of the cardstock. A small, translucent object slid out onto the green blotter. It was a pill, a tiny capsule that looked exactly like the daily heart medication Vivian had taken for the last 3 years. But as I brought it under the magnifying glass, the light revealed a subtle, terrifying difference. The color was off a shade too pale, with a tiny, bitter chemical scent that shouldn't have been there. You see, in my job, if a bridge fails, everyone sees the collapse. But a family that falls apart from the inside long before the first stone drops. As I stared at the off-color pill, I realized my cardiologist's son hadn't been treating my wife's heart. He'd been stopping it. The grief that had been a dull ache sharpened into a blade of pure, determined fury. I looked at the clock. I had 12 hours until the meeting. 12 hours to decide if I was going to be the victim of this collapse or the one who brought the whole structure down on their heads. The heavy oak doors of the Oak Haven Library groaned like a dying beast as I pushed them open, the smell of old paper and floor wax, doing nothing to mask the scent of the trap I was walking into. I stepped into the foyer, my heavy boots thudding against the polished stone, feeling the weight of the off-color pill in my pocket like a lead sinker. The library was a Gothic fortress of silence, its towering shelves casting long skeletal shadows across the carpet. I had spent the night dissecting the horror of my son's medical betrayal, and as I walked deeper into the dim light of the reference section, that fury had settled into a cold, clinical blade. I wasn't just a grieving widower anymore. I was an inspector looking for the point of catastrophic failure. I navigated the narrow aisles, my eyes scanning the high-backed chairs until I saw him. Elias Thorne was seated in the furthest corner, a small mountain of yellowed archives from Crawford Ashford Construction spread out before him like a messy autopsy. He looked older than the voice on the phone, his skin the color of old parchment, and his eyes two sharp, bright sparks in the gloom. "You've kept a clean house for 40 years, Arthur," he said, not bothering to look up from a crumbling 1981 payroll ledger. "It's a shame your sons are so messy." I sat across from him, the wood of the chair creaking under my weight. "I didn't come for a history lesson, Elias. I came because you seem to know why my sons are treating my wife's grave like a construction site. Tell me why you're stalking my family." Elias finally looked up, a thin, mirthless smile touching his lips. "Stalking is such a vulgar word. I prefer to call it risk management. I've been watching Julian and Dominic for 2 years now. Did you know Julian has a penchant for high-stakes crypto debt?" I gave him a little nudge in that direction, a tip on a sure thing that wasn't. It's amazing how quickly a financier turns into a predator when he owes the wrong people $10 million. Black and white, grainy. My son's the cardiologist and the financier playing gravedigger. Elias slid a manila envelope across the table. The paper felt heavy, impregnated with the dust of the archives. I opened it with trembling hands, and the first image hit me like a physical blow. It was a high-resolution, time-stamped photograph taken at 3 a.m. There, in the grainy light of a trail camera, were Julian and Dominic. They weren't weeping. They were digging. My sons, wearing expensive Gore-Tex jackets and holding common garden shovels, were frantically moving the earth above Vivian's fresh casket. My stomach turned a sour wave of nausea rising in my throat. "Look at Julian's hands, Arthur Elias," whispered his voice, a dry rasp that filled the small alcove. "That's not a son's devotion. That's a debtor's desperation. They weren't just burying grief. They were hiding the mechanism of her murder. They're using shovels. I stammered, my eyes locked on Dominic's face, which looked clinical and detached, even in the dark. Why are they using shovels? Elias leaned back, the shadows deepening in the hollows of his cheeks. Because a medical examiner looks for chemicals in the blood, but they don't look for a punctured lung if the heart already stopped. They had to retrieve something, Arthur. Something Dominic left behind in his haste to satisfy the first tier of the policy. A library is supposed to be a place of quiet knowledge, but every word Thorne spoke felt like a brick through my window. I looked at the second set of documents in the envelope, a photocopy of a tiered life insurance policy. My name was at the top, but the fine print was a death warrant. It was a $12 million policy that only paid out the full amount if both parents died within 90 days of each other. Vivian was the first hurdle, Elias said, tapping the paper with a gnarled finger. You're the final installment. Every time Dominic checked your pulse this week, every time he insisted on a new heart-healthy supplement, he wasn't looking for longevity. He was checking the countdown. $12 million. I whispered the number, feeling small and insignificant compared to the void opening in my chest. Is that all I'm worth to them? I had built bridges to cross chasms, yet I couldn't bridge the gap between the men I thought I raised and the monsters they had become. If the foundation of your life is built on a lie, do you burn it down, or do you wait for it to crush you? The existential horror of it was a cold weight in my limbs. I realized then that my home wasn't a sanctuary. It was an execution chamber where the air was being slowly replaced with poison. Elias began to gather his papers, the yellowed edges of the 1981 archive files, clicking together like dry bone. You should know, Arthur, that this room isn't as private as it looks. Silas, that groundskeeper you've trusted for 20 years. He's been on my payroll since the day Vivian's heart started failing. He's standing in the biography section right now, making sure I don't give you anything more than you can handle. My head snapped toward the end of the aisle, but I saw only the still silent rows of books. The paranoia I had felt on the drive over now had a name and a face. Elias leaned in the scent of peppermint on his breath, suddenly overpowering a sharp contrast to the smell of old age and decay. He whispered, his face inches from mine. The next dose Dominic gives you won't be for your heart, Arthur. It will be for his debt. Don't go home alone. I stood up, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I clutched the manila envelope to my chest, the grainy texture of the photos burning through the paper into my skin. I walked out of the library, leaving the shadows of the past behind, but the sunlight outside felt just as cold. I knew the trap was set, the bridge was failing, and the only way to survive was to be the one who pulled the lever first. The front door to the estate didn't just feel heavy, it felt like the lid of a casket closing behind me. I stood in the foyer, my lungs burning from the icy walk back to the car, while Elias's warning vibrated through my bones. Don't go home alone, he had said, but here I was, trapped within the very walls I had spent a lifetime paying for. The silence of the house was different now. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a retired life, but the suffocating stillness of a trap. I shed my coat, my hands trembling as I moved toward the kitchen, my ears straining for any sound that shouldn't be there. I found Dominic already in the kitchen, his back to me, unnervingly calm, as he stirred a small ceramic pot on the stove. The light reflected off the stainless steel appliances, giving the room a sterile, clinical feel that matched my son's demeanor. He didn't jump when I entered. He simply turned a gentle, practiced smile on his face, the one he surely used to deliver terminal news to his patients. You look pale, Arthur, he said, his voice a smooth baritone that used to bring me comfort. It's your heart. It can't take much more of these excursions. I've made you a special blend of herbal tea to calm your nerves. I stared at the cup he held out. Even from a distance, I caught the metallic almond bitter scent of the liquid, a smell that had no business being in a domestic kitchen. I realized then that Elias was right. Dominic isn't waiting for my heart to fail on its own. He is actively poisoning me in real time, accelerating the clock for his $12 million payout. I'm not thirsty, Dominic, I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. Put the kettle down. He didn't move, the cup remaining extended like a command. It's for your own good, Father. Drink. The fern didn't just droop. It began to wilt with unnatural speed. its vibrant green leaves losing their life and curling at the edges as the chemical saturation took hold. I had feigned a sudden violent coughing fit, jerking my arm so that the tea splashed out of the cup and directly into the large potted fern sitting on the breakfast nook. Dominic's eyes narrowed a flash of something cold and predatory crossing his features before he could mask it. I didn't wait for his reaction. I mumbled an excuse about needing fresh air and retreated toward the terrace, my heart hammering against my ribs this time from genuine terror rather than medication. I stood on the stone porch looking down at the wilted, blackened remains of the plant I could see through the window. It had taken seconds for the toxin to work. If I had swallowed that liquid, I would be on the floor right now, another tragic statistic of a failed heart. The rage began to replace the fear, a cold, clinical anger that I had used for 40 years to dismantle faulty structures. I looked out toward the formal gardens, the twilight casting long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawn. That was when I saw him. Silas, the groundskeeper, stood like a gnarled oak in the twilight, his hands permanently stained with the oil of the earth and the secrets of the estate. He was 55, a man of few words who had looked after these grounds for 2 decades, but now he was crouched near the tree line, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He wasn't working. He was observing. How many years had I called this man a friend while he measured me for a shroud? I didn't give him the chance to disappear into the woods. I started down the terrace steps, my frantic footsteps crunching on the gravel path. "I see you, Silas," I called out, my voice cutting through the damp evening air. "Don't move." He hesitated for a heartbeat before bolting toward the potting shed at the edge of the property. I followed the adrenaline, masking the ache in my joints as I pursued him through the deepening gloom. I reached the shed just as he slammed the door, but I didn't let him lock it. I threw my weight against the wood, the door swinging open to reveal the cramped, earthy interior. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and fertilizer. A single flickering yellow light of a dying bulb overhead cast a sickly glow over the rusted tools and bags of mulch. Silas was backed against a workbench, his breathing heavy and ragged. I didn't give him room to breathe. I lunged forward, wrapping my hand in a handkerchief before catching a small glass object hidden among a pile of burlap sacks. It was a cold glass vial identical to the ones Elias had shown me in the photos. There were fingerprints on it, Dominic's perhaps, or Silas's own. "How much is Dominic paying you to watch me die, Silas?" I hissed, shoving the vial into his face. "Because I know exactly what he's worth, and I know you're getting crumbs. I didn't have a choice, mister. Arthur." He stammered, his eyes darting toward the door. "He said you were already gone in the head, that you were a danger to yourself. He told me it was medicine to keep you quiet. You'd think a man facing death would pray. I didn't. I negotiated. I saw the fear in his eyes, and I realized I had the leverage. I knew about the insurance policy now, and I knew Silas was the weak link in their chain. "I'm not going to call the police, Silas," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "Not yet. I'm going to give you a choice. You can go to prison as an accomplice to murder, or you can start working for the man who actually owns this land. Tell me everything Dominic told you to do, or I'll make sure you're the first one they arrest when they find that vial." Silas dropped to his knees, his face pale and sweating in the flickering light. It wasn't just the vial he was worried about. It was the second person he claimed was watching the house from the woods. I shoved the toxin vial against Silas's throat, the glass biting into his skin as the blizzard's first howl rattled the shed's corrugated roof. He was trembling now, a broken man, stripped of the stoicism he had worn like armor for 20 years. I demanded to know who else was on the property, my voice a rasping blade that cut through the smell of damp earth and motor oil. Silas didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the dark line of the woods visible through the cracked shed door. "He's got a camera with a lens long enough to see the sins on your soul, Arthur," he whispered, his hands fumbling with a pair of shears on the workbench. He claimed it was a man he didn't know by name, but one who carried a heavy brass badge and a professional chill. A private investigator. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was being hunted from 2 sides. One side wanted me dead for a payout, and the other side wanted me caught for a crime I hadn't committed. "If Dominic finds out I'm talking to you, I'm as dead as your father, Silas. added his voice cracking. It was the first time someone had spoken the truth about my father's end aloud. Silas revealed that the Watcher wasn't working for Dominic at all, but for a mysterious third party who had been tracking the $12 million debt long before Vivian's heart supposedly failed. The wind didn't just blow. It screamed like a woman being flayed alive. I looked at the manila envelope I'd clutched under my arm and then back at the terrified groundskeeper. I knew that the only way to secure Silas's loyalty and find the truth about the missing millions was to exhume my father's emergency stash, a cache of cash and records buried in the family cemetery. For a rainy day, it was pouring now, but the rain was ice. "Keep digging, or I'll tell the police you were the one who spiked the tea," I hissed, grabbing a rusted spade from the wall and thrusting it into his dirt-stained hands. "The ground is frozen, Arthur." "This is madness," he argued, but the threat of a prison cell was heavier than the frost. We stepped out into the whiteout, the freezing gale immediately clawing at my thin coat. I felt my heart fluttering a sickening, uneven skip that reminded me the poison from the tea, though mostly spilled, was still dancing in my blood. I marched him toward the forest path, my boots sinking into the fresh drifts. My heart was a trapped bird in a cage of ice, beating its wings against my ribs until they cracked. I forced myself to move every breath, a jagged shard of glass in my throat. We reached the iron gates of the family plot, the hinges letting out a high-pitched screech that sounded like a warning. Silas began to dig into the site next to my father's headstone, the rhythmic thuck of the shovel in the frozen earth, the only sound besides the wind. I stood guard, the sting of snow hitting my eyes, making me see ghosts in the swirling white. I saw a silhouette at the edge of the pines, a darker shadow against the gray-white blur of the storm, motionless and predatory. The Watcher. I gripped my cane like a weapon, but the figure didn't move. It just existed there, a silent witness to our desecration. The rhythmic scraping of steel on stone continued for what felt like hours. Silas was chest-deep in the hole now, his breathing a series of wet, desperate grunts. We were looking for a metal lockbox, a heavy container my father had sworn would save the street. Clear name if the bridges ever fell, but as the hole deepened, the sound changed. It wasn't the sharp ring of metal on metal. It was a dull, wet thud. "That's not a metal box, Silas." "Why is it soft?" I asked, leaning over the edge of the pit. "Lord help us, there's something else down here." Silas whimpered, dropping the shovel. He reached down into the dark, pulling back a layer of heavy, crinkling industrial plastic. Have you ever felt the exact moment a hope dies? It feels like the sound of steel hitting bone. I stared down into the grave, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to reveal the truth of our legacy. It wasn't gold or cash waiting for us in the frozen dirt. The grave had been used as a fresh disposal site for a recent unknown victim, buried shallowly above my father's coffin, to ensure it would never be found by a casual observer. The plastic tore under Silas's shovel, revealing a flash of blonde hair and a familiar gold watch that definitely didn't belong to my father. It was a woman's watch, the diamonds on the face catching the light, mocking the filth of the grave. I realized then that the debt wasn't just about money. It was about blood. My sons hadn't just been digging to find an inheritance. They had been digging to hide a body. My legs felt like they were made of water. The cold of the cemetery seeped into my marrow. I looked back toward the woods, but the shadow was gone. We weren't alone in the storm, and the person who had been watching us now knew exactly what we had found. I looked at Silas, who was staring at the hair with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "We have to cover it up," he whispered, but I knew better. The bridge had already collapsed. All that was left was to see who survived the fall. The gold watch was still ticking a rhythmic mechanical pulse that mocked the stillness of the arm it was attached to. I stared down into the freezing pit, my breath hitching as Silas used the edge of the spade to clear more of the heavy, crinkling industrial plastic. The smell reached me then, a cloying mixture of formaldehyde and frozen rot that made my stomach churn. I reached down, my fingers trembling as I gripped the edge of the shroud and peeled it back. The face that stared back at me was one I knew all too well. Marcus lay twisted in the plastic, his sharp lawyer's features softened by the bloat of death, wearing a suit that cost more than Silas made in a year. Marcus deceased, The family's 52-year-old former estate lawyer and a man I had considered a confidant had been missing for 3 weeks. Everyone assumed he had finally fled his gambling debts, but the truth was far more clinical. His body hadn't been here for 3 weeks. It had been kept in cold storage and moved to this fresh soil just hours after Vivian's service, hidden shallowly as a ticking legal time bomb for me to find. Marcus wasn't a gambler who ran from his debts. Silas, I whispered, my voice thick with a dread that felt like swallowed glass. He was the only one who knew where the real ledger was. As I shifted his stiff, cold hand, I saw his fingers were curled around a small bundle. I forced them open, the grit of dirt beneath my fingernails stinging as I retrieved a cluster of empty glass vials. They were identical to the one I had found in the shed, the same toxin Dominic had tried to feed me in my tea. Those vials, they're the same ones Dominic has in the medicine cabinet, aren't they? Silas asked, his voice barely a whimper. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I realized the grave wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a stage being set for a final act. Lawyers usually die behind desks. Marcus died in a trash bag. I began to search the pockets of his heavy wool overcoat, my hands moving with a desperate, frantic efficiency. In the inner breast pocket, I found a sealed envelope addressed to the local precinct of the state police. The paper was crisp, untouched by the moisture of the earth. I tore it open, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Inside was a single sheet of stationery covered in a script that made the world tilt on its axis. It was my handwriting. Every loop, every slant of the characters was a perfect replica of my own hand. It was a fabricated confession, a detailed document claiming that I had murdered Marcus and my own father to cover up the total financial ruin of the St. Clair estate. It's my hand. I breathed the ink, blurring as my vision clouded with a white-hot fury. Every loop, every slant, but I never wrote a word of this. Dominic and Julian weren't just taking my life with a designer digitalis. They were erasing my legacy. They were ensuring that when I died, I would die a monster, a disgraced patriarch who had butchered his friends to hide his failures. How do you prove you didn't write a note when the ink matches your favorite pen and the words match your deepest fears? I looked at Silas, who was backing away from the grave, his face a mask of terror. He's not just taking my life. I told him, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. He's taking my name. I felt a sudden sharp prickle on the back of my neck, that instinctive sense of being watched that had haunted me since the cemetery gates. I looked up from the pit, my eyes scanning the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks that bordered the family plot. A faint artificial blink caught my eye, a tiny red spark nestled in a notch of a nearby oak tree. My blood ran cold. Silas, don't move, I hissed, grabbing his arm with a grip that made him wince. Look at the notch in the oak. It was a trail camera professional grade and perfectly camouflaged. It had been positioned to record the entire exhumation. They weren't just waiting for me to find the body. They were filming me standing over it with a shovel in my hand and a confession in my pocket. The watcher Silas mentioned wasn't just observing. They were gathering the final evidence needed to execute the frame-up in the eyes of the law. We're not alone, I whispered, the trap panic finally beginning to claw at the back of my throat. We were never alone. The lens of the camera was a tiny glass eye, God's witness, rewritten by the devil. I realized then that every move I had made tonight had been choreographed by my sons. They had led me here. They had let me dig my own legal grave while standing over Marcus's literal one. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold iron fist. The blizzard was a shroud, and the camera was the witness. I looked at the manila envelope, the vials, and the forged note. I was holding a one-way ticket to a life sentence provided the poison didn't kill me first. I realized then that Elias hadn't just predicted this. He had watched my sons drag Marcus here weeks ago. He let them commit the crime so he could use the burial site as the perfect stage for my own entrapment. The wind shrieked through the stones, a high, thin sound like a funeral whistle. I knew I had seconds to act before the trap snapped shut completely. I lunged for the camera, my boots slipping on the muddy edge of the grave, just as a blinding white flashlight beam cut through the snow from the tree line. The light was absolute, pinning me against the open grave like a moth to a board, I shielded my eyes, my heart skipping a beat, as a shadow stepped out from behind the pines, the silhouette tall and imposing against the swirling white of the storm. The game hadn't just changed, it had ended, and I was the only one left on the board who didn't know the rules. Adrenaline is a liar. It told me my heart was strong enough to outrun a bullet, even as the snow turned my breath into shards of glass. The blinding white light of the flashlight held me captive against the edge of the open grave, the dark silhouette behind it as still as a headstone. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm that I knew was partly the poison and partly the primal urge to claw my way out of this trap. I expected the voice of a police officer, the cold click of handcuffs, but the voice that came through the storm was familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. "Put the shovel down," Arthur the figure said. The light shifted, revealing Miller Silas's son, who looked less like a groundskeeper and more like a man who enjoyed the sharp, clinical edges of surveillance. Miller was 34, a former private security contractor with a face that seemed carved from cold flint, and he was the last person I expected to see holding a high-end trail camera. I didn't drop the shovel. Instead, I gripped it tighter, the grit of frozen earth biting into my palms. "Julian didn't hire you to watch me, Miller." I rasped my voice, sounding like old paper tearing. "He hired you to watch a dead man walk into his own grave?" I saw the slight hesitation in his grip on the flashlight. Miller was a man of cold logic, but he was still Silas's blood, and I could see the confusion flickering behind his eyes. I pulled the forged suicide note from my pocket, the white paper whipping frantically in the wind. "This is the script they wrote for me. It says I killed Marcus. It says I killed my father. How long do you think it will take them to write a script for you? Once I'm in the ground, Julian and Dominic don't leave loose ends, Miller. Give me the card, or we both end up in the bag with Marcus. Fear is a cold sweat. Betrayal is a frozen heart." Miller's eyes darted toward the open pit, where the lawyer's expensive suit was still visible under the torn plastic. The logic of my argument was undeniable. He was the only witness left, and in my son's world, witnesses were just liabilities with heartbeats. I didn't give him time to overthink it. I lunged forward, not with the shovel, but with my free hand snatching the trail camera's memory card from the device, as Miller stepped back in a daze of indecision. I didn't wait for him to recover his professional chill. I turned and fled into the blinding white heart of the storm, leaving Silas and his son standing over a grave that was supposed to be mine. I didn't head for my sedan. I knew they'd be watching the main roads. I circled back toward the estate's maintenance area, my boots heavy with the mud of the cemetery. I found the old service truck a rusted beast with a heater that hummed like a dying hornet. I hotwired the ignition, a skill I'd picked up 40 years ago and never expected to use again, and drove through the whiteout toward the city. The highway was a ghost road, the world reduced to the 10 feet of gray asphalt visible in my headlights. I propped a battered laptop on the passenger seat, the blue glow of the screen reflecting off my glasses as I accessed the memory card. The footage was a revelation. It wasn't just me they had recorded. The camera had captured Dominic and Julian arguing near the garden trellis 2 nights ago. Their voices were muffled by the wind, but their faces were clear. Dominic looked like a man on the verge of a breakdown, his hands shaking as he spoke about the $12 million. Julian, however, was a statue of ice. He was keeping a black file on his phone, a digital insurance policy against his own brother's volatility. If your brothers are wolves, do you try to outrun them, or do you lead them to each other's throats? I felt a cold tactical resolve settle over me. I wasn't just an inspector anymore. I was the architect of their collapse. By the time I reached Julian's city penthouse, the sky was a bruised pre-dawn purple. I used an old emergency key I'd kept since the day he moved and a father's precaution that he had forgotten to change. The interior of the penthouse was a temple to greed, expensive leather-stale cigar smoke, and a silence that felt artificial. I bypassed the rudimentary security of his home office with the ease of someone who understood the structural flaws of a house better than its owner. I found the desk a massive slab of mahogany that smelled of success and rot. I didn't go for the safe hidden behind the framed architectural blueprint. I knew Julian was too sentimental to hide anything truly dangerous there. I went for the mundane leather ledger sitting in plain sight. Inside, tucked between boring expense reports, I found a series of wire transfer receipts that made my blood run cold. "You always were too sentimental about blueprints," Julie and I whispered to the empty room. I stared at the numbers. $10 million moved to a Cayman account in Julian's name only 3 days before Vivian died. He wasn't just helping Dominic, he was robbing him. $10 million to a Cayman account, and not a cent for Dominic. The ledger was a confession in columns of black ink and red lies. I felt a surge of vindicated malice. The alliance between my sons was a bridge built on shifting sand, and I had just found the crack in the main support. I heard the distinct chime of the private elevator. Someone was coming up, and I was standing in the middle of a crime scene of my own making. I looked at the ledger, then at the elevator doors, my heart giving one final warning thud against my ribs. I flattened myself against the cold marble of the kitchen island, counting the seconds between the elevator's chime and the heavy tread of a man who thought he'd already won. My breath was a ragged, shallow thing, barely enough to sustain the frantic rhythm of a heart that was being systematically dismantled by my own flesh and blood. I expected Julian's sleek, silent step, but the footfalls that echoed through the penthouse foyer were heavy, rhythmic, and laced with a familiar, aggressive impatience. It was the entrance twist I hadn't prepared for. The person in the elevator was Dominic, not Julian. I realized then that the alliance between my sons was a house of cards already leaning in the wind. Dominic was already hunting Julian for the missing $10 million a debt collector in a tailored suit. I stayed motionless, listening as he moved into the home office. "Where is it, Julian? Where are you hiding my money?" he roared, his voice cracking with a desperation that bordered on insanity. From my vantage point behind the island, I could hear the sound of office furniture being violently overturned, the crash of expensive lamps, and the splintering of mahogany. I needed to leave, and I needed to leave now before he heard my heart beating through the very walls of his brother's sanctuary. I slipped out through the service stairwell, the sound of Dominic's rage-fueled destruction providing a chaotic cover for my escape. By the time I reached the street and found my stolen service truck, the sky was beginning to bleed into a cold gray morning. I drove back to the estate in a trance of clinical focus, my mind already calculating the next phase of the collapse. I reached my private study by 8:30 a.m., the familiar smell of old paper and tobacco doing little to mask the lingering metallic scent of the tea Dominic had tried to feed me. I didn't rest. I pulled out a portable forensic kit I had acquired during my years of paranoid bridge inspections, a relic from a time when I thought I was checking for structural grout, not lethal toxins. I carefully tested the residue in the bottom of the teapot and the clear liquid from the vial I'd retrieved from the potting shed. The chemical tang of the reagent turning a deep bruised purple was my scientific confirmation. It was Digitalis Z, a designer analog that mimics an acute myocardial infarction and then vanishes from the bloodstream within hours. Clinical, quiet, the perfect murder for a man with a bad heart. They didn't just want me dead, they wanted me to look like a failure on my way out. A man whose weak heart finally gave way to the pressure of a dying legacy. I realized then that a second dose was already prepared, likely waiting for me in my own medicine cabinet, intended to be the final fatal blow during our upcoming meal. If you are still here with me navigating through this storm of betrayal, please let me know you're still watching. Drop a 1 in the comments if you believe the evidence I found is the key to my survival, or if you just want to see justice served. Your support truly keeps the story alive. And a quick reminder, the following events contain certain dramatized and fictional elements added for storytelling purposes. If this isn't for you, feel free to stop the video right here. But for those staying, the real truth is about to be revealed. I spent the rest of the afternoon rigging the stage. I moved through the grand dining room with the methodical dominance of an inspector, marking a condemned structure. I wired the room with pinhole cameras and high-sensitivity microphones, hiding them with practiced ease in the ornate crown molding and the elaborate floral centerpieces. I could feel the tiny rhythmic click of the lenses as I tested the feeds on my phone. I created a digital dead man's switch, a simple script that required me to enter a code every 30 minutes. If I failed the recorded footage, and the embezzlement files would be blasted to every major news outlet and the SEC simultaneously. I set the table for 3, the heavy silver cutlery cold against my palm, each piece positioned with the precision of a surgeon. I placed the roasting lamb in the oven, its scent masking the smell of the fear that had finally begun to settle in my gut. Under Dominic's plate, I slipped the forged confession I had recovered from the grave, a mirror meant to reflect his own malice back at him. "Smile for the camera, brothers," I whispered to the empty high-ceilinged room. "You're about to become very famous. 1 meal to settle the debt. 1 meal to end the sterling line." I checked the vibration of the phone against my thigh, ensuring the switch was active. The dining room wasn't a place for food anymore. It was an electric chair, draped in linen, a silent witness to the final audit of the St. Clair family. I stood at the head of the table, my hands clasped behind my back, waiting for the wolves to come to the door. The front gates buzzed the sound, grating through the house like a serrated blade. I walked to the window and watched as 2 sets of headlights cut through the thickening evening fog, sweeping across the gray stones of the driveway. The wolves had arrived for dinner, and for the first time in 40 years, I was the one holding the leash. I smoothed the silk of my tie, my hands as steady as a surgeon's, while the engine roar outside signaled the start of my own wake. The headlights swept across the dining room walls, momentarily illuminating the hidden camera lenses I had painstakingly installed. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, the air thick and humid, smelling of rosemary and the faint underlying rot of a family's dying legacy. I heard the front door open, followed by the heavy rhythmic thud of footsteps approaching. Dominic and Julian entered the dining room, their mutual distrust vibrating in the air like a live wire. Julian, usually a statue of corporate poise, looked slightly frayed at the edges, his eyes darting to Dominic with a coldness that confirmed the rift I'd discovered in his office. Dominic was still agitated, his movements sharp and clinical, as he glanced toward the sideboard where my heart medication sat in a small deceptive pile. I welcomed them with a smile that felt like a burial shroud. "I invited you here to discuss the $12 million, I said, my voice calm and wise, masking the rage boiling beneath my ribs. "I think it's time the sterling name paid its debts." I raised a glass of heavy red wine, the crystal clinking softly against my ring. "You look better than expected," Arthur Dominic replied, his voice a smooth baritone that lacked any genuine warmth. "Must be that new tea blend you've been drinking." He didn't know I had watched that tea wilt a fern into ash. I played the role of the dying, defeated patriarch, perfectly allowing my hand to tremble slightly as I lowered the glass, lulling them into a sense of premature victory. "You've watched a family dinner before, but you've never watched a dissection." I sat down and gestured for them to do the same. We began to eat the clink of fine crystal against bone china, the only sound in the room for a long minute. I watched Julian's face. It was a map of every lie he'd ever told, and I was holding the compass. I casually mentioned a dream I'd had about Marcus, our old lawyer, and I saw Julian's fork freeze midair. His eyes met mine wide and searching, looking for a crack in my resolve. "Julian, did you tell Dominic about your new Cayman investments?" I asked, my tone light, almost conversational. "Or was that meant to be a surprise for the funeral?" The silence that followed was absolute. Dominic's head snapped toward his brother, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of red. "Shut up, Arthur," Julian hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "You're rambling. Your heart is making you delusional." But the damage was done. The built-in distrust between the hammer and the hand was finally shattering the bridge they had built to kill me. Julian's face was a map of every lie he'd ever told, and I was holding the compass. I watched them begin to bicker, Julian trying to explain away the receipts I had found in his office, while Dominic accused him of being a pathetic snake. Their constructed alliance was crumbling under the weight of the specific lethal knowledge I had gathered. I watched them tear at each other like wolves in a trap, forgetting for a moment that the man they were supposed to be killing was still sitting at the head of the table. The second course was served a rich, dark stew. I stopped eating entirely, the bitter, almond-like aftertaste of the wine still lingering on my tongue. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the empty digitalis Z vials I had retrieved from the grave. I placed them on the table, one by one, lining them up like chess pieces on the white linen. "One of you is a murderer, and the other is just a thief?" I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying growl that silenced their arguing. "I haven't decided which is which yet." I pushed the stew away, my eyes locked on Dominic. I told them I hadn't touched a bite of the food, but I asked if they were sure they could say the same about the wine I had poured them. I then reached for the forged confession, the one Marcus was meant to be holding, and slid it across the table toward Dominic. "That's my handwriting, isn't it?" I asked, watching his eyes widen as he read the words. "Only I didn't write it. Which of you is the poet?" The silver platter wasn't for the lamb. It was for their heads. I could see the hidden camera's blue flicker under the eaves, recording every second of their terror. Dominic's hand flew to his throat, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. He looked at the glass of wine, then back at me, his eyes pleading. But I wasn't finished. I revealed the final piece of the puzzle. I hadn't poisoned their wine at all. That would be too messy. Instead, I had anticipated exactly what a cardiologist would do when faced with a dying father. I had poisoned the very heart medication pill I knew he would try to force-feed me during the meal to finish the job. I had used my inspector's precision to swap the pill into the very blister pack Dominic had brought with him tonight. He was so blinded by his own arrogance and the rush to finish the job that he never thought to check the medicine he believed he controlled. I had swapped the pills in the medicine cabinet hours ago. A subtle rhythmic choking sound began to escape Dominic's throat as the toxin started its slow, agonizing work on his heart, forcing him to witness the collapse of his plans before his body finally gave way. He tried to speak, but the words were lost in a wet, choking sound. Julian stood up, knocking his chair over, looking at his brother with a mixture of horror and cold calculation. Dominic's hand flew to his throat, as his face turned a violent shade purple. But it wasn't the wine, it was the pill he believed I had swallowed, which I'd swapped with his own toxin. I sat back, the dead man's switch vibrating against my thigh, watching the structure finally collapse. I watched the silver spoon slip from Dominic's trembling fingers, the clatter against his china plate sounding like the first stone of an avalanche. The wet, desperate sound of his wheezing filled the grand dining room, a frantic staccato that signaled the onset of the very digital-ese analog he had intended for me. His hand flew to his throat, his face turning a violent shade of purple as the swapped pill began its work. Across the table, Julian froze his corporate poise, dissolving into a mask of naked terror. I stood slowly, the weight of the moment grounding me. I didn't reach for a phone to call an ambulance. Instead, I reached for the edge of the heavy linen tablecloth. With a single fluid motion, I ripped it away. The fine china shattered against the floor, a cacophony of white porcelain shards that scattered like bone fragments. Below the linen, the mahogany surface of the table was no longer empty. Dozens of printed bank statements and $10 million wire transfer receipts were taped to the wood, illuminated by the cold, predatory blue glare of the hidden cameras I had rigged into the crown molding. The smell of ozone from the camera rigs mingled with the scent of the roasting lamb, creating a sickening clinical atmosphere. "It's a beautiful ledger, isn't it, Julian?" I asked, my voice calm and wise, cutting through Dominic's choking gasps. "I especially like the part where Dominic goes to prison for my murder, and you disappear to the Caymans with insurance payout." Julian's eyes darted from the documents to his brother, who was now clutching his chest and slumped over the table. You pathetic snake," Dominic managed to gasp, his voice a wet rattle. "I was doing this for us." Julian recoiled, his hands shaking. "I had to protect myself, Dominic. You were losing your mind. Mahogany shouldn't bleed, but under this light, the ink of those bank statements looked like fresh gore. The power had shifted completely. Dominic's toxin-induced collapse had acted as the final catalyst, a physical manifestation of the rot that had destroyed my family from within. Julian was no longer the confident financier. He was a cornered animal, and the brotherly alliance that had been built on my downfall was now a trap closing in on them both. Dominic lunged across the table, his fingers locking around Julian's throat, with a strength born of pure adrenaline-fueled spite. They tumbled toward the floor, a tangle of limbs and shattered china. Julian, pinned against a sideboard, screamed that the $12 million debt wasn't just about Julian's crypto losses. It was a payoff to keep the circumstances of my father's death quiet. I stood back watching the two men I had raised tear at each other like starving wolves. It was Julian's idea. Julian cried out, his voice cracking as he fought for air. He said the old man was going to disinherit us both. I pulled a single vial from my pocket, the clear liquid shimmering under the chandelier light. "Tell me how he died," I said, my voice echoing in the humid room, "and I'll give you the air you're begging for." I didn't tell them it was merely saline. Have you ever seen a man negotiate for his next breath? It's a messy, loud business. They both stopped staring at the vial with a hunger that was almost pathetic. It was a cold, hard truth that I had suspected for years but never dared to voice. My father hadn't died of a weak heart. He had died of a weak family. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the static of their mutual betrayal. Every word they spoke was being recorded, a digital confession that would ensure neither of them would ever see the sterling name as anything other than a curse. Just as Julian opened his mouth to deliver the final blow to his brother's soul, the double doors of the dining room were kicked open. The sound was like a gunshot. Framed in the threshold was the silhouette of Elias Thorne. He wasn't the frail, bookish librarian I had met at the archives. He stood with a professional predatory stance, holding a suppressed pistol with a matte finish that sucked the light out of the room. "Elias," I asked, my heart giving a warning thud against my ribs. "You were supposed to be my leverage." Elias didn't look like a friend anymore. He looked like a period at the end of a very long sentence. "Sit down, Arthur," he said, his voice a dry, rhythmic rasp that carried the weight of a death warrant. "The play is over, and the audience wants their money." He stepped into the room, the cold air from the hallway following him like a shroud. He revealed that he hadn't been guarding my interests at all. He was the primary enforcer for the creditors, the men who truly owned the sterling debt. He had been using me to consolidate the brothers in one room, waiting for them to destroy each other, so he could claim the estate and the life insurance policy for his true employers. The betrayal was absolute, a triple cross that made my own traps look like child's play. I looked at the man who had been my only confidant, and I realized I had invited the devil to the table. Elias didn't aim at the brothers. He leveled the barrel directly at my heart and whispered, "Dominic was right about one thing. Arthur, your heart really is a liability." The blue light from the cameras flickered, a silent witness to the final collapse of the bridge I had tried to save. I was cornered out of moves and staring down the barrel of my own legacy. The barrel of the gun was a cold black eye that saw straight through my skin to the irregular rhythm of my failing heart. I stood frozen at the head of the dining table, the weight of Elias's betrayal settling over me like a layer of lead. For weeks I had viewed him as my only true ally, the wise librarian who held the keys to my past. Now, as the blue glare of the hidden cameras caught the matte finish of his suppressed pistol, I realized I had merely been a piece on his board. Elias Thorne looked at me with a professional detached chill that made his previous warmth seem like a fever dream. "I wasn't guarding the books, Arthur," he said, his voice a dry rhythmic rasp that carried the weight of a death warrant. "I was guarding the investment." He explained that his 40-year tenure at the library was to cover a long-term post as a silent auditor for a cartel of creditors who had truly owned the sterling name for decades. My son's father hadn't just owed $12 million. He had sold our very identity as collateral for a debt that never ends. I was never a friend to him, and I was never a guardian to you. I was a shepherd waiting for the flock to be fat enough for slaughter. The sterling name belongs to my employers, Arthur. You and your wretched sons are just the current tenants, and your lease has officially expired. Is it still a home if the walls have been keeping count of your debt since the day you were born? The realization was soul-crushing. Every memory of this estate, every beam and bridge I had inspected was tainted by the shadow of these creditors. Dominic lay wheezing on the floor, and Julian sat paralyzed by the table, both of them reduced to mere biological assets in Elias's ledgers. Elias took a step closer, the heavy mechanical click of the gun's safety echoing in the cold, stagnant air of the dining room. He was preparing to clean the slate to execute the final audit that would leave the creditors with the insurance payout and no witnesses. I felt the sound of blood rushing in my ears, but beneath the panic, the bridge inspector in me was still looking for the stress fracture in Elias's own foundation. "Wait," I said, my voice steady despite the irregular thumping in my chest. "I have something you didn't account for. I didn't just find Marcus's body in that cemetery, Elias. I found the original 1982 ledger." Elias paused, his eyes narrowing. "You're lying," he spat. "That book was burned 40 years ago." I reached slowly for my phone, the blue-white glare of the screen illuminating my face as I opened a file. I found it buried beneath the false bottom of my father's emergency stash. I showed him the digital scan, scrolling through the faded, handwritten entries of the firm we had built together. "Does the cartel know their most loyal watchdog was the one who stole the first $5 million in 1982? I asked, watching the color drain from his face. Elias's hand shook. The wolf was seeing the trap for the first time. The ledger proved that he hadn't just been an auditor. He was the primary thief who had facilitated the embezzlement that bankrupted his own employers 4 decades ago. He had been hiding in plain sight, using the Sterling family as a shield to mask his own historical crimes. "You facilitated the very collapse you were sent to prevent," I said, my voice gaining a hard, reflective edge. "If I press one button this ledger and the recording of my son's confession go directly to your employers, they won't just fire you, Elias. They'll audit your life." I watched the professional facade crack, the wise librarian, dissolving into a terrified man who had spent 40 years running from his own shadow. The smell of old paper and digital ozone seemed to intensify as the silence stretched between us. "I have the dead man's switch, Elias," I reminded him. "If you shoot, the cartel gets the ledger and your head within the hour. But if you help me, we can both walk away." Elias looked at the screen, then at the gun, then back at me. "You're more of a Sterling than your father ever was," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of vindicated terror and reluctant respect. The 1982 ledger was a ghost, and it had finally come to claim its medium. I offered him the deal. He would help me disappear, use his connections to erase the digital trail of my existence, and he would take the fall for the brothers' unfortunate accident. It was the only way for him to survive the creditor's inevitable investigation. Elias lowered the gun, the barrel no longer a threat, but a heavy weight at his side. He looked hollowed out, a man who had realized that his life of loyalty was built on a lie I was now holding over him. The cold air of the dining room seemed to grow even more oppressive as he nodded slowly, accepting the terms of his surrender. I sat back, the weight of the night finally pressing down on me. But for the first time I felt a flicker of true control. I had dismantled the auditor. I had turned the shepherd into a servant. Just as the tension seemed to break, a new shadow stretched across the shattered china on the floor. Elias lowered the gun, his eyes hollow, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the silent figure who had just appeared in the doorway behind him. A tall, shadow-wrapped man stood in the threshold, his presence sucking the air from the room like an open airlock. I didn't know his name, but I knew his role. He was the end of the line. The final player in the game had arrived, and the board was about to be flipped one last time. I had already sent the GPS coordinates of the grave and the digital recordings to Detective Foster's private encrypted line, ensuring the law would arrive before the blizzard could bury the evidence. Silence in the Sterling manor was never just an absence of noise. It was the sound of a debt waiting to be collected. I watched the color drain from Elias Thorne's face as the shadow in the doorway grew into a solid, imposing reality. Elias lowered the gun, his eyes hollow, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the man who had just appeared behind him, a figure whose presence seemed to suck the very oxygen from the dining room. This was the true proxy, the courier for the faceless creditors, who had held our lives in the balance for 40 years. But he didn't move like an assassin. He walked with a measured clinical pace toward the table, ignoring the whimpering Julian and the still shuddering Dominic. He placed a small silver drive on the mahogany surface of final delivery. He looked at me, his eyes devoid of malice or mercy, and spoke with a voice that sounded like shifting slate. "Vivian didn't leave you because of the money, Arthur. She left to make sure the money could never find you. This man wasn't here to kill me. He was here to deliver my wife's final act of protection. The drive contained a digital key, a master override for the 1982 ledger I had found in the cemetery. As the files decrypted on my phone, the full picture emerged. Vivian had known about the family's original sin from the very beginning. She hadn't been a passive victim of the Sterling legacy. She had been the silent archivist of its corruption, waiting for the moment when the truth could be used to set me free. Elias stood, broken the revelation of his own exposure at my hands, and the courier's presence stripping him of his professional facade. The courier turned to him, the command silent but absolute. "Clean up the mess, Elias. The Sterling name is dead. The debt is satisfied, Mr. Sterling, but the house is no longer yours." The fire didn't just eat the paper, it devoured the chains that had bound my wrists since birth. I led Elias and the courier into the grand library, the air thick with the smell of old dust and the copper tang of fear. In the massive stone fireplace, I piled the millions in physical cash. I had painstakingly recovered the blood money that had incited my sons to fratricide. On top of the stack, I placed the physical 1982 ledger, the original document that had served as the foundation for 40 years of betrayal. Elias watched me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "You're burning a fortune, Arthur," he cried, his voice cracking. "You'll have nothing." I looked at him then, at the flickering orange flames as I dropped the match. "It's just ink and paper, Elias. It only has power if you're afraid to lose it." As the high-rag content paper ignited, the room was filled with a brilliant purging light. I watched the currency blacken and curl, the millions of dollars that had defined my worth in the eyes of my children, turning into nothing but heat and light. I realized that as long as this money existed, the cycle of poisoning and greed would never end. By burning it, I wasn't losing my wealth. I was destroying the gravity that kept pulling the wolves to my door. The fire was cathartic, a funeral pyre for the Sterling name. What is a king without a kingdom, a man who can finally sleep? I felt the heat on my face, a warmth that finally reached the cold, hollow spaces in my chest. The courier watched the destruction with a mask of indifference, satisfied that the transaction was complete. The house was forfeit, the money was gone, and the records were ash. I was a man with no assets and no heirs yet. For the first time in my 68 years, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. The structural integrity of my life was no longer dependent on the weight of gold, but on the strength of my own resolve. The sirens weren't a warning, they were a lullaby. The blue and red lights began to dance against the frosted glass of the library windows, signaling the arrival of the authorities I had summoned with my dead man's switch. The digital confession of my sons was already in the hands of those who would ensure they spent the rest of their lives in a cage of their own making. I walked away from the fire, leaving Elias to face the ruins of his audit. I stepped out through the terrace doors and into the midnight air of the estate gardens. The crisp, clean scent of fresh snow filled my lungs, a sharp contrast to the smell of burning paper inside. I reached into my inner pocket and found a final letter from Vivian, one I had been too afraid to open until this moment. Her handwriting was steady, a wise and reflective script that reached across the years to find me. My heart was never the liability, Arthur, she had written. Your loyalty was. She had known I would try to save a bridge that was already condemned. She had known I would stay until the last stone fell. I sat on the old stone bench, the sub-zero night, feeling strangely comfortable. The irregular thumping in my chest, the skip that had haunted me for years, finally steadied into a slow, rhythmic beat. I'm finally debt-free, Vivian, I whispered into the dark. Let the snow cover the rest. As the first police cruiser rounded the drive, I didn't hide. I sat on the stone bench and watched the smoke of $10 million rise to meet the stars. The fading blue and red lights reflected off the ice of the fountain, painting the world in colors of justice rather than blood. I watched the smoke drift upward, a dark ribbon against the silver moon, and I knew the Sterling ghost was finally gone. I was just a man in a garden waiting for the morning to begin. I have spent my life inspecting bridges, searching for hidden fractures before they could collapse. Yet the greatest fracture was inside my own home. My story is one of family betrayal, and I say that with a heavy heart, because family betrayal doesn't begin with violence. It begins with silence, pride, and the lies we ignore. When greed replaces loyalty, family betrayal becomes inevitable. If I could speak to the man I was years ago, I would tell him, "This do not assume blood alone guarantees love. Watch the small cracks. Ask the difficult questions. Justice within a home must come from integrity long before courts ever become involved. What happened in my house forced me to confront the meaning of family justice. True family justice is not revenge. It is the courage to stand for what is right, even when the people you love stand against you. In the end, family justice meant choosing truth over inheritance. My belief now is simple. Money builds walls, but character builds families. I also believe that God sometimes allows us to face darkness so we can finally see what matters. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this journey. Please leave a comment and share your thoughts. What would you do if you found yourself in Arthur's position, facing that kind of impossible choice? I would truly value hearing your perspective. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories. A gentle note: while inspired by themes surrounding inheritance conflicts and family dynamics, certain elements were dramatized for storytelling. If this story isn't your style, feel free to explore other videos that may suit you better.